I was standing at the chapel entrance when Evan squeezed my hand and said they'd be here soon. I didn't answer. I just looked at the 3 empty rows on the left side of the aisle, the ones meant for my family, and felt the cold air slip through the gap under the door. A woman in the second row leaned toward her husband and whispered something. Not quiet enough. I caught the words, "bride's side," and no one came. I didn't react. I kept my shoulders straight and my face still, the way I'd learned to do when things break quietly instead of loud. What I didn't know then was that 4 months later, my father would stand on my front porch with 2 police officers and tell them I'd stolen from him, and that the proof he'd hand over wouldn't just be a lie. It would be something my brothers helped him build. But that morning, all I had was silence, sunlight through tall windows, and the smell of pine from the old beams overhead. The wedding went on. Evan's family filled the right side completely. His mother cried. His father smiled. I stood there and made promises I meant, but the whole time I felt like I was watching myself from somewhere far away. Afterward, we drove to a cabin near Stone Ridge. The snow was thick that year. Evan made a fire, and I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, staring at my phone. No missed calls, no messages. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just sat down next to me and waited. I put the phone face down on the wood floor and said, "They sent the invitation back." He nodded. He already knew. What he didn't know, what I didn't know, was that the envelope I'd mailed to my father had never been opened. That my brother Mark had written "Return to sender" across the front in handwriting that looked close enough to my dad's to fool me. That the whole thing had been a choice, not an accident. But I'd find that out later, after the officers left my house and the court paperwork showed up with my name next to the word "suspect." For now, I just sat there on the floor, listening to the fire crack and feeling the weight of something I couldn't name yet. 4 years before that empty chapel, I was 23 and working my first season with FEMA. We were stationed outside Boulder when the wildfire started, the kind that moves faster than you expect, eating through dry grass and scrub like it's hungry. I was at my father's house that afternoon. He'd called earlier and said he needed help moving some equipment before the wind picked up. My brothers were supposed to be there too, but only my father showed up. The shed behind the house was old, wooden, packed with tools and boxes he'd been collecting since before I was born. He kept an ambulance in there, a 1987 Ford. It didn't run anymore, but he'd worked on it for years when he was still with the fire department. He used to say it was the last thing he had that still meant something. When the fire jumped the ridge, he started shouting. Not at the flames, at me. He told me to get the ambulance out, to move it down the driveway before the shed caught. I heard him, but then I heard something else. A child's voice, high and sharp, coming from the cabin at the north edge of the property. My father rented it out sometimes to families passing through. I didn't know anyone was staying there. I ran toward the sound. The door was warped from the heat, and I had to kick it twice before it opened. Inside, a boy, maybe 6 years old, was pressed into the corner under a table. The roof was already smoking. I grabbed him and pulled him out. By the time I got back to the yard, the shed was gone. Collapsed inward, flames twisting up through the beams, the ambulance with it. My father stood there staring at the wreckage. Then he looked at me. Not relief, not concern, just something cold and final. He didn't say anything. He turned and walked to his truck, got in, and drove off while the fire crew was still working the line. 2 days later, my brother Luke called. He said Dad told them I'd let the ambulance burn on purpose, that I'd chosen a stranger's kid over my own family, that I didn't care what mattered to him. I tried to explain. Luke hung up before I finished the sentence. Mark never called at all. A week after that, Mrs. Clary, the neighbor who used to watch me when I was little, pulled me aside at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable. She said my father had been trying to get a loan using the ambulance as collateral, that he owed money to people she didn't know the names of, that losing it wasn't just sentimental, it was financial. I didn't know what to say. She patted my arm and told me to be careful. I went home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out how saving a child had turned into something I needed to apologize for. I never got an answer. The months that followed were quiet in a way that felt deliberate. My father stopped answering my calls. My brothers stopped replying to messages. I told myself it was temporary, that people needed space after something like that. But the space didn't close. When Evan and I got engaged, I mailed the invitations anyway. I wrote a short note to my father. I didn't apologize, but I didn't defend myself either. I just said I hoped he'd come. The envelope came back a week later, unopened, snow-damaged, a postal stamp from Boulder across the front. That night, my father sent a single text. "Don't expect anything from us." I put the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Evan asked if I wanted to talk. I said no. He didn't push. What I didn't say was that I'd already started to understand something, that the fire hadn't created the distance. It had just given them permission to make it official. The court envelope arrived on a Monday in February. Evan brought it in from the mailbox and set it on the counter without saying anything. The seal was red. Official. The kind of thing that doesn't show up unless something's gone wrong. I opened it standing up. The header said Jefferson County District Court. My name was listed next to the word respondent. The complaint was filed by my father. The charge was misappropriation of family funds. I read it twice. Then I sat down. The document claimed I'd accessed a savings account that belonged to my mother and withdrawn money without permission. It listed dates, amounts, and a reference number for an account I'd never heard of. My mother passed away 6 years ago. I handled some of her paperwork after she died, but there was no savings account, just a checking account that had been closed within a month. I flipped to the next page. There was a demand for evidence: GPS logs, work records, witness statements. They wanted proof of where I'd been on a specific night in late January. Someone had told the court I'd been seen near my father's property. I pulled out my phone and opened the FEMA portal. I checked the date they listed. I'd been on duty that night, more than 100 miles away, working a flood response in Greeley. The GPS log showed my location every 30 minutes. I screenshot the entire file and saved it to my desktop. Evan read over my shoulder. He didn't say anything, but I felt him go still. The signature at the bottom of the complaint looked like my father's. Same slant, same pressure. But something about it felt too clean. My father's handwriting had gotten shaky in the last few years, especially after the tremor started in his right hand. This signature was smooth, controlled. I'd seen handwriting like that before. On a birthday card at Mark's apartment last year. I set the paperwork on the table and opened my laptop. I pulled up every document I still had from my mother's estate. Bank statements, closing notices, the will. There was no savings account. But when I searched her name in the county records database, 2 accounts appeared. Both opened 8 months ago. Both with activity that lined up almost exactly with periods when my brothers had been asking me for money. I didn't call my father. I didn't call my brothers. I made a folder on my desktop. I labeled it Evidence. I started saving everything. That night, my phone buzzed at 11:47. A message from an unknown number. No name. Just a line of text. Give it back or this gets worse. There was an audio file attached. I played it. The voice was slurred, angry, familiar. Evan listened and said it sounded like Mark. I saved the file. I didn't reply. The next morning, I went back through my mother's paperwork. I found something I'd missed before. A handwritten ledger tucked inside an old recipe binder. Page after page of loans. Dates, amounts, names. Most of them were tied to Mark. At the bottom of each entry, the same line. Mark will repay. He never had. She'd been covering his debts for years, quietly, without telling anyone. I took a picture of every page. 2 days later, I found a note in my mailbox. No envelope. just a folded piece of paper with my name on the outside. The handwriting was Luke's. I recognized the heavy slant, the way he looped his L's. The message was short. Stop ignoring this. It's only going to get worse if you don't cooperate. The same handwriting had signed one of the documents in the court file. I put the note in the folder. Then I opened a new document on my laptop. I titled it Timeline. I started filling it in, piece by piece, with dates and locations and screenshots and recordings. I didn't know yet what I was building. I just knew I needed to see it all in one place. Evan asked if I was going to respond. I said no. Not yet. He nodded. He trusted me to know when. I kept working. The pounding on the door came at 7:15 on a Thursday morning. Denver was buried under fresh snow, and the street outside looked quiet and clean. I opened the door expecting a delivery. My father stood between two Jefferson County officers. Snow was melting off his coat. His face was set, expressionless. For a second, I thought he'd come to talk. He hadn't. He told the officers he wanted to report a break-in, that I'd entered his home without permission and taken money from a lockbox in his bedroom. The floor felt like it tilted. One of the officers asked if I'd been to his property recently. I said no. He asked if I had a key. I said I hadn't had one in over 4 years. My father handed over a tablet. On the screen was a video from his backyard security camera. Grainy. Time-stamped. A hooded figure moving quickly across the yard toward the back door. The officer compared the figure's height to mine. He said the resemblance was there. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. I pulled out my phone and opened the FEMA portal. I showed him the GPS log from that night. The timestamp placed me at a rescue station more than 100 miles away. The officer nodded. My father immediately said I could have hired someone to do it for me. Even the officer looked surprised by that. The second officer asked about shoe prints they'd found in the yard. I told him I wore a size 7.5. He wrote it down, then said the prints were size 11.5. My father hesitated. He said maybe it was a visitor. That pause told me more than anything he'd said so far. The officer asked how he'd accessed the camera footage. My father said he pulled it himself, but my mother had set the password years ago, and he'd never been able to remember it. The officer asked again. My father admitted Mark had sent him the video. The officer examined the file more closely. He said the metadata showed it had passed through 3 devices before reaching the police. He asked if my father knew that. My father didn't answer. The officer pointed to something on the screen. The hooded figure was wearing a specific type of beanie. He said it was sold at only one store in the area, a sporting goods shop next to a bar called Rusty Bluff, Mark's usual spot. My father looked past me, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. He didn't say anything else. The officers left without arresting anyone. They said they'd follow up. I closed the door and leaned against it. Evan was standing in the hallway. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just said, "They're not stopping." I nodded. That afternoon, I got an email from FEMA. A complaint had been filed accusing me of misusing internal data. My clearance was suspended pending review. I opened the attachment. The complaint letter was handwritten. I recognized the slant immediately, the heavy pressure on the Y's, the strange loop on the L's, Luke's handwriting. I forwarded the email to my personal account. I saved a copy to the folder. An hour later, a coworker called. She said someone had been calling the office asking about my work history, asking if I'd ever been disciplined. She said the voice sounded older, formal, my father's voice. That evening, a hospital bill arrived in my mailbox. It was addressed to my mother. The payment had been made through an account under my name, an account I'd never opened. I checked the account number against my records. It didn't match anything I had. I called the bank. They confirmed the account existed and had been opened 6 months ago using my information. I asked for the application. They said it had been submitted online. The IP address traced back to a location in Boulder. I hung up and added the bill to the folder. Evan pulled up our home security footage from the past 2 weeks. Mark appeared twice. both times standing under the street lamp across from our house, staring at our window, phone in hand. Both visits happened the week before the court notice arrived. Evan's voice was quiet when he said, "They planned this." I nodded. I opened my laptop and started a new document. I titled it Steps. Step 1, collect every piece of evidence. Step 2, verify every claim they've made. Step 3, wait for them to make a mistake. I didn't need to add step 4. I already knew what it was. Let them think they're winning. I drove back to Boulder on a Saturday. The old house stood exactly where I'd left it, quiet and worn, the fence still marked from the fire. The wind carried a faint smell of ash, even after all these years. I let myself in through the side door. My father had changed the locks, but I still had the gate key, and the kitchen window latch had been broken since I was in high school. Inside, everything felt frozen. The same furniture, the same stains on the carpet, the same clock on the wall that had stopped working in 2019. I went to the kitchen and opened the lowest cabinet. It creaked the way it always had. Beneath a stack of bills and old newspapers, I found a leather notebook I'd never seen before. I opened it. Page after page of loans, all under my mother's name, each one ending with the same note. Mark will repay. He never had. She'd carried every one of his debts without telling anyone. She'd protected him quietly, and he'd let her. I took pictures of every page. Outside, Mr. Peterson was working in his yard. He waved me over. He said he'd seen people coming and going from the house for months. One woman had stayed so long he thought she'd moved in. I asked what she looked like. He described her. I knew who it was before he finished. Mark's ex-girlfriend. I thanked him and got back in my car. I found Mark at Rusty Bluff, leaning against his truck in the parking lot. He looked worse than I expected. Thinner, tired. He saw me and straightened up, but he didn't run. I walked over and stopped a few feet away. He said, "I knew you'd figure it out." I didn't say anything. He kept talking. He said they needed money, that Dad told him I owed them, that the woman in the video wasn't me, it was his ex. She'd used an old key he'd kept. They staged it because they thought I'd just pay them to make it go away. I asked why he sent the officers to my house. He looked at the ground. He said Dad thought it would work, that I'd panic and settle. I asked if Luke knew. He nodded. I asked if they knew about the forged account. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. I got back in my car and left. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just drove home and added his confession to the folder. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. I didn't sleep much the night before. I went over the folder one more time. Every document, every screenshot, every recording. Evan asked if I wanted him to come. I said yes. The county building was cold and bright. Fluorescent lights, wooden benches, the smell of old paper and floor cleaner. My father sat across the room in the complainants section. Mark and Luke stood behind him, silent. When the panel called the session to order, the FEMA representative stepped forward first. She presented the GPS logs. The panel reviewed them without expression. The data was clear. I'd been over 100 miles away during the time the video claimed I was at my father's house. The panel noted it. One of them asked my father if he had any response. He didn't. Next, a technical analyst took the stand. He explained that the video file had been altered. The metadata showed it had passed through 3 devices before being submitted as evidence. The final device belonged to someone named Mark Leahy. My father shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. I placed the leather notebook on the table. I opened it to the pages listing my mother's loans. I explained what each entry meant. The panel leaned in. At the bottom of the final page, in my mother's handwriting, was the line that had broken something in me the first time I read it. "Don't let Danica know." The room went quiet. Then the officers brought in Mark's ex-girlfriend. She looked nervous, but her voice was steady. She said Mark had asked her to cross the yard that night wearing a hooded jacket, that he'd given her the key, that they told her it was harmless, just something to pressure me into helping them with money. She said they'd offered to settle her debts if she did it. The panel exchanged looks. The lead officer asked my father if he had anything to add. He shook his head. The panel issued their ruling. The accusations were false. The evidence had been fabricated. I was cleared of all charges. The file would be closed. I stood up and looked at my father. I said, "I didn't take anything from you. I just stopped letting you take from me." He bowed his head. Mark looked away. Luke stared at the floor. I walked out with Evan beside me. The air outside was cold and clean. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt finished. 3 months after the hearing, Colorado shifted into spring. The snow pulled back up the mountains, and wildflowers started pushing through the thawed ground in small, stubborn patches. Life felt quieter, lighter, like something that had been pressing against my chest for years had finally let go. FEMA reinstated my clearance 2 weeks after the panel closed the case. My supervisor called and said the complaint had been formally withdrawn. She didn't ask questions. I didn't offer explanations. I went back to work. Same station, same team. But something felt different. I wasn't carrying the weight of waiting anymore. Evan and I repainted the living room. We replaced the kitchen table. Small things, normal things. The kind of things you do when you're not spending every night going through files and building timelines. One evening, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. It was Lydia, a girl I'd mentored during her first year with FEMA, back when she was 19 and still figuring out if she could do the work. Her father had died when she was young. She used to say I reminded her of what he might have been like if he'd lived. She said she was getting married in June. She asked if I would walk her down the aisle. I didn't know what to say at first. Then I said yes. The day of her wedding was warm and clear. The church was small, tucked into the hills west of Boulder. The light came through the windows in soft golden sheets. I stood at the back with Lydia while the music started. She slipped her arm through mine and leaned close. She whispered, "Thank you for showing up." It was such a simple thing to say, but it hit me harder than I expected. I walked her down the aisle. I stood beside her while she made her promises. And when it was over, I sat in the back row and watched her dance with her new husband under strings of lights that swayed in the evening breeze. Evan found me there and sat down without saying anything. I said, "I think I'm okay now." He nodded. He'd known before I did. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name on the front in handwriting I recognized. Luke's. I opened it slowly. It was short. He said he was sorry, that he'd let fear turn him into someone he didn't recognize, that he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He just said he was sorry. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in a drawer. I didn't write back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I didn't throw it away either. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun drop behind the mountains. The air smelled like pine and fresh dirt. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. A car door closed. Everything felt ordinary, settled. Evan came outside and sat next to me. He asked what I was thinking about. I said, "Nothing really." And for the first time in a long time, that was true. I kept working. Same job, same team. But I started saying yes to things I used to avoid. Training sessions, mentorship assignments, small moments where someone needed steadying, and I happened to be there. Lydia stayed in touch. She'd text me pictures from hikes or send updates about her new job. Normal things, easy things. The kind of relationship that doesn't ask for more than it gives. One afternoon in late summer, I ran into Mrs. Clary at the farmer's market in Denver. She was older, moving slower, but she smiled when she saw me. She asked how I was doing. I said I was good. She said she'd heard about what happened with my father, that people talk in small towns. She didn't ask for details. She just said she was glad I was all right. Before she left, she mentioned a young woman from her church, a girl in her early 20s who'd been cut off by her family after she reported her brother for stealing her student loan money. She said the girl didn't know what to do, that she was scared and alone. Mrs. Clary asked if I'd be willing to talk to her. I said I would. We met the following week at a coffee shop near the university. Her name was Amber. She was quiet at first, careful with her words. But when she started talking, I recognized the tone, the confusion, the guilt that doesn't belong to her but sits there anyway. I didn't tell her what to do. I just listened. And when she asked if it gets easier, I told her the truth. It does. But only after you stop waiting for them to change. She nodded like she'd already suspected that. Before we left, I gave her my number. I told her to reach out if she needed help with paperwork or just needed to talk to someone who'd been through it. She thanked me. I said it wasn't a favor, just something I wished someone had done for me. When I got home, Evan was organizing the garage. I stood in the doorway and watched him work for a minute. He looked over and asked if I was okay. I said yes, and I meant it. That evening, I sat on the porch again. The sky was turning purple at the edges, and the air smelled like cut grass and distant rain. I thought about my wedding day, the empty rose, the whispered question, the weight I'd carried for so long. It didn't hurt anymore. It was just something that happened, part of the story, but not the end of it. I can't choose the family I was born into, but I can choose the kind of person I become, and I choose to show up, even when the people who raised me never did. If this story reminded you of something you've been through, or if you know someone who needs to hear it, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, so drop that in the comments. And stick around, because 2 more stories are coming up next that I think you'll want to hear. Thanks for listening.